کنفرانس در کلوپ ملی مطبوعات آمریکا با حضور نیوت گنگریچ، رئیس پیشین کنگره و کاندیدای ریاست جمهوری. سیاست جدید آمریکا در قبال دیکتاتوری آخوندی. واشینگتن، 20 اکتبر 2017.
The resolution is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
در کنفرانسی در کلوپ ملی مطبوعات در واشینگتن که توسط سازمان جوامع ایرانیان در آمریکا برگزار شد، نیوت گنگریچ، رئیس پیشین کنگره و کاندیدای ریاست جمهوری، درباره سیاست جدید ایالات متحده در قبال رژیم آخوندی و لیست‌گذاری تروریستی سپاه پاسداران، مسیر آینده و راهکارهایی که باید برای عملی کردن این سیاست اتخاذ کرد به سخنرانی پرداخت. این کنفرانس تحت مدیریت سفیر لینکلن بلومفیلد، مدیر کل پیشین وزارت خارجه آمریکا در امور سیاسی نظامی برگزار شد و شماری از نمایندگان هیئت‌های دیپلماتیک در واشینگتن، متخصصان امور خاورمیانه و ایران در اندیشکده‌ها و بانک‌های فکری و خبرنگاران رسانه‌های گروهی آمریکایی و بین‌المللی در این برنامه حضور داشتند. توجه شما را به گزارشی از این کنفرانس جلب می‌کنیم.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Majid Salishpour. I'm the Political Director for Organization of Iranian American Communities. We are an organization of Iranian Americans spread across 40 states in the United States. Our goal is to promote a democratic, free, secular republic in Iran, which we believe is in the best interest of the United States, the global community, and the people of Iran. With the advent of the U.S. policy announcement on Iran, we believe U.S. policy needs to keep in mind the aspirations of the people of Iran.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Lincoln Bloomfield, and I have the high honor today of introducing our special guest and having a conversation with him after his remarks. This is an ironic task because Newt Gingrich is known to everyone in this town and everyone in this country. He's quite famous and deservedly so, former Speaker of the House. He's well known originally for bringing the Republicans back into the House of Representatives as a majority in 1994, campaigning on the contract with America. And I think it's worth mentioning the contract with America because there's another group, which is Iranian in heritage, which has their own 10-point plan. So I see a similarity here. Newt Gingrich is a Fox News contributor, senior advisor at Dentons, the world's largest law firm, senior scientist at Gallup. He was a candidate for President of the United States. He's the author of 27 books and has done numerous media events, which is why he's so well known. He has had a particular interest in the future of the U.S. healthcare system and has received high awards from the American Diabetes Association, March of Dimes. He launched the Center for Health Transformation in 2003. Very much of a Renaissance thinker, very broad gauge, an ideas person, and something that Washington has benefited from and continues to benefit from. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Newt Gingrich.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Lincoln. Thank you all for coming out today. This is a very interesting time. I think that the President, in his October 13th decision and speech, to not recertify, actually, I think, followed just about exactly the right path. He didn't break out of the agreement, but he communicated that the agreement was vulnerable. He also reminded all of us that the agreement's not just about nuclear weapons, but that the way the Corker-Cardin bill was written, part of decertification can be a function of national interest and a function of activities other than the nuclear program. And I think in that sense, it was a watershed event for him to say, this is not going well enough for me to be able to certify as president that it's in our national interest to continue it. But at the same time, I think it was prudent to not leave the agreement, but rather to say the agreement has to be revisited, it has to be rethought, and it may well have to be renegotiated. This is, in the end, not about the nuclear program. This is about a regime which just, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Parliament, in passing a defense bill, was chanting death to America. Now, as a historian, I am always leery when I see dictatorships that use certain kind of language. You know, one of the reasons that Churchill understood Hitler is he actually is probably the only British parliamentarian of his generation who read Mein Kampf, because he understood that, in fact, Hitler was not somebody that you could negotiate with, compromise with, because he represented such a terrible future. Well, we've gone through a long, elaborate process in the Western world of trying to continually re-explain the Iranian dictatorship. And let me emphasize, first of all, it's a dictatorship with a facade of democracy. But if you're not part of the dictatorship and you're not acceptable to the dictator, you can't run. And therefore, to pretend that the elections actually offer any serious choice to the Iranian people is simply a fantasy. And so I think what President Trump did in his decision, and I thought this was a very important moment for his administration. I think if he had said, gee, and remember, he'd gone to the United Nations and he had made a speech which had probably the strongest condemnation of Iran, of the Iranian dictatorship, ever uttered at the United Nations. For him to then turn from that and passively certify would have made a mockery of everything he had said, and what he said was very strong. But instead, by decertifying, he signaled that he was actually listening to his own words, and that maybe the rest of us should also listen to his words. And then if you look at the decertification speech, which I think, without question, is the most methodical outline of how bad the dictatorship is that any American senior leader has ever uttered. I mean, it's quite a remarkable speech. And what it tells you is that in the long run, it is not just in the interest of the United States to find a better way to do inspections or to find some other device that allows us to continue with the current agreement. It is in the long run in the interest of the United States to find a way to replace the dictatorship. That as long as that dictatorship is in power, as long as it is able to spend money, as long as it's able to project terrorism around the world, it is ultimately a mortal danger to the United States. And, of course, it is a terrible thing for the Iranian people. I mean, you have a dictatorship which in 1988 killed 30,000 people, something which, for some reason, the New York Times and the Washington Post don't find to be horrifying. I mean, it is a fantasy to suggest that the dictatorship would survive without repression. And so you have a repressive dictatorship which projects power all the way to the Mediterranean, has plans to build a port in Lebanon that it would control, has plans to build missile factories in both Syria and Lebanon. I mean, we have no models for how you deal with a threat on this scale. And it's all going to get worse. And so I think what the president has begun, particularly by extending beyond talking about the nuclear agreement, by talking about the IRGC, and beginning to say, look, here is the heart of the problem. It is a Revolutionary Guard Corps dedicated to terrorism. It's a Revolutionary Guard Corps dedicated, and this goes all the way back against the Americans, to the 1979-1983 period. From the perspective of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, they've been at war with us even if we weren't aware that we were at war with them. And so I think you've got to see it in that context. I think the Treasury took the first step in beginning to designate the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. I think that step, and this will be one of the great challenges the president faces across the whole government, that you can make big decisions at the top, but you then have to find ways to get a bureaucracy that actually implements them in an aggressive, effective way. And I think that it's perennially a challenge when you have a system our size outside of a war the size of World War II. The bureaucracies are very cumbersome, very slow, very often the thing you want to do is understaffed, and the thing you no longer want to do is overstaffed, but you can't figure out how to get rid of the overstaffed part to be able to transfer the resources to build up the understaffed part. And so I think the administration is going to have a period here of coming to grips with how do they effectively implement the president's directions. And part of it's going to be at Treasury, where I think they have the potential to really dramatically weaken the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps if they apply the resources to it and if they're tough-minded and extend it to all of the institutions. I mean, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is a large part of the Iranian economy, and if, in fact, we're serious about isolating them and restricting them, we're going to have a huge impact that ripples back through the entire Iranian economy. So this is an example of the sort of thing we have to think about. I also think that we have to look at, and this is a real sea change. I mean, I've been actively involved in this, including involvement in trying to defend the good name of the National Council of Resistance of Iran and the MEK, all the way back to when I was Speaker. Because basically the Iranian dictatorship ran a false flag operation to set up a totally phony designation, which the State Department bureaucracy went along with. So for a long period of time, we were willing to listen to the actual dictatorship while not listening to the resistance, even though the resistance was trying to tell us the truth about the dictatorship, which was lying to us. And we've gradually worked our way back through, and some of you have been involved in this for your entire adult lifetime, and you know that this has been a very difficult, at times, at places like Camp Liberty and Camp Ashraf, a very painful process. But I think that we are beginning to move in the right direction. And I hope that this administration will now, as part of this process of beginning to unravel both the IRGC and then ultimately the dictatorship, will reach out in a much more collaborative way to coordinate information and to coordinate advice and to find ways to work together. Because I do believe that, in fact, the National Council of Resistance of Iran has a tremendous potential. And I also want to say that I believe that Mrs. Rajavi has done an amazing job of leading an organization through a very long, very difficult period. I think that she is one of the examples of a symbol of resistance to the dictatorship that would have a huge impact across the whole country and would also send an important signal to Europe about the way in which our policies are moving. So I think these are dangerous times. I think between the North Korean crisis and the Iranian challenge, particularly the Iranian challenge in southern Lebanon and southern Syria, that we may well have. But I do think that the president began that process and that he deserves a great deal of credit for having been willing, one, to insist on decertification, and two, twice now, both at the United Nations and in his speech about decertification, telling the truth vividly and clearly and decisively about the Iranian dictatorship in a way that no senior American political leader has ever done before. So I give the president real credit for having started to move in the right direction. And it's a direction, frankly, that almost every senior American military leader understands, because they are infuriated that the Iranians have been routinely helping kill Americans and have paid virtually no cost for it, whether you go all the way back to the Marines in Lebanon in the 80s, or you look at what the Iranian equipment that was coming into Iraq and being used for IEDs. It clearly was manufactured in Iran and was being sent in for the purpose of killing Americans. So I think you'll find that the senior military is very willing to work in a diligent, direct way to undermine and isolate the Revolutionary Guard and to begin the process of rolling back the Iranians out of places like Lebanon and Syria, and ultimately replacing the dictatorship with a popularly elected government. So I'm strategically optimistic. I'm I think it's an enormous amount of work ahead of us, but I think it is doable, and I think the tide of history is with freedom. It's not with the dictatorship. And that's why, despite occasional setbacks, I think in the long run, we will get stronger and they will get weaker. But thank you all very much for coming out. I think this is a very important time and an extraordinarily important topic.
Great. Thank you. Perfect.